Okay, so today we get to start a new chapter. We're going to dive in here to chapter 14. And dare I say, this is one of my favorite chapters to talk about in the whole freshman social studies year. Yeah, have I ever said that before? Well, I mean it this time. This is one of my favorite chapters. And we're going to be talking about expansion of industry. There's a handful of reasons why I get so fired up to teach this stuff, and one of them is, you're going to see here, even in the first lecture, that there is some cool local history, some stuff about our part of the country in particular, right here in western Pennsylvania, that is tied into this chapter. Also some history about the Pittsburgh region, southwestern Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from, and so is still local to us. It's really local to me growing up. So anyway, we'll get into some of those things with the local history. We'll do that in a few minutes. But the first thing that we want to dive into here today is just section 1. And we're going to title section 1, the expansion of industry. One of the things that you can probably assume we're going to be talking about, and one of the industries that's going to be covered in section 1 is what? What is that? Got the light bulb there, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about electricity. Not today, but eventually as we go through the chapter we will, or this section. Before we get into any of the specifics about the expansion of industry, I always like to start just by answering the question, why? Why did we experience an era post-Civil War up to 1900 where we just had this explosion of industrial growth and change in our country? How and why did it happen here and then? Well, there are some reasons for that, and we're going to go through them. One of the reasons, it's actually 3 reasons. One of them is let me sum this up by saying that these 3 things, and probably a few other things, all just sort of came together at the right place at the right time, and it was probably a little bit based on just luck, and it just happened. So what are these things, that all these pieces that sort of got put together at the right time and the right place to create this expansion of industry? One of them was the fact that the United States had a wealth of natural resources. What do I have pictured here? This is an oil derrick. You can see oil spraying out of the top of it, right? So that was just one example of a natural resource that we started to recognize we could pull out of the ground and utilize. We had all kinds of different minerals that we started to figure out ways to mine and extract from the ground. We had massive resources of timber, trees, forests. We had running water. We had all kinds of things that were just occurring naturally here in the United States that would be a big part of having a growth of industry. But that alone isn't enough to make it happen, so that's just the first part. The second part is that in the pre-Civil War era, and certainly during the war, and then consequently after the war, the political situation, the government situation in America was such that it was a government that was very much supportive of the idea of big business. It really, it starts to happen before the Civil War, but the Civil War, because of the need for factories and industries in the North in particular to produce things to fight the war, like we talked about this in the last couple chapters about producing bullets and guns and uniforms and boots and cannons and so on and so forth, the northern economy was booming during the war years. And it had already sort of gotten into this point when we had the first industrial revolution before the Civil War, where the government looked at this as kind of the wave of the future. And so the government and the idea of growing big business, it came together and the two went hand in hand. In fact, one of the things that we learned about in the Reconstruction chapter was that in some cases the government and these big businesses got too hand in hand together because it led to some corruption and some scandal. But nonetheless, it does also support the idea of growth of business and industry. And then the third piece of the puzzle is what we call urbanization. Urbanization, you should be able to figure out based on this picture, is what? It's the growth of cities. It's actually technically the term urbanization it refers to the movement of people out of rural areas and into these urban centers, these cities. And so one of the other things that we see happening during and after the Civil War is that cities, particularly in the North, but cities all over the country, start to grow exponentially. Part of it is simply because there are jobs and there is work there and people move from the rural communities into these cities, but also because we see an influx of immigration after the Civil War, more people coming into this country from other parts of the world, and those people were most likely drawn to go to the cities. So, you put all three of these things together, and you have the natural resources to produce and create things. You've got a government that is willing to support the idea and do whatever it has to do to make it happen, and you have a massive workforce living in these cities looking for jobs in factories, and that's where the urbanization piece fits in. This is a picture of, I believe this is New York City, if I remember correctly where I got this, of right around the Civil War, post-Civil War era, in the latter part of the 1800s. I don't think I would want to try to walk from one end of this photo to the other down that street. That's how packed full it is with people. And so the cities, we'll talk more about that at great length later in the chapter, were a big part of this. Okay. Well, I want to start today with again, just some sort of big picture ideas, and then we'll as we go through the chapter, we'll kind of focus in on some specifics. But there is kind of, this slide is almost like saying we could add a fourth piece to that list that we just had there. A fourth reason why I guess we had this industrial growth in our country, and that is the fact that we have this massive explosion of inventions and ideas in this era as well. And with that, things start to change dramatically. So I'm going to give you just sort of the big idea here. How many of you know what a patent is? Ask around. If you have parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles or relatives that work in some of the industries even in our area, like GE or Wabtec, or some of the other factories and industries throughout the county here in the city, you ask around, there's a good chance that maybe you know somebody that has created a patent for something. A patent is a protection on your invention or your idea. So if you come up with some idea that no one else has ever thought of, some invention, some new product, some new thing, some new tool, or some new gadget, and you do your research, you find out that no one has ever thought of this thing, you can go through the process of getting a patent. It basically protects that idea or that invention. It says, you are the one that came up with this idea, and no one can ever claim that they came up with it. So there's a whole agency in the government, a patent office, that governs this. Well, in the years 1790 to 1860, so we're looking at like 70 years before the Civil War, the government issued somewhere around 36,000 patents to people in this country. 36,000 new inventions and new ideas were issued. All right, now that's all in the time period before we get to where we are in this chapter. How many patents do you think were issued in this era? In less than half of that many years, in the next 30 years, 1860 to 1890, which by the way is pretty much the time period we're going to be talking about after the Civil War, in that 30-year stretch, over 500,000 patents were issued. So the growth of ideas and inventions and new gadgets and new technologies in this era, right after the Civil War, in this 30-year period, it blew anything away that we had ever seen in our history previously, right? So, I mean, we could spend a whole semester taking a class just on talking about all the new inventions and ideas that were invented after the Civil War. There were things like typewriters, the phonograph, indoor electricity, which we'll talk about, refined gasoline, new kinds of fuels, et cetera, all kinds of new inventions. We'll touch on some of those as we go through the chapter. And part of the reason that this was able to happen, it's sort of wrapped up in that first slide about the money and the support from big businesses and natural resources and this massive amount of people living in a small area here in the United States, not a small area, but a concentrated group of just really smart people that happen to be all living in this era. You put all that together and you just have this opportunity for new inventions and new ideas to flourish. So the Civil War and the growth of the booming industries during the war years in the North had a lot to do with this as well, because a lot of people made a lot of money selling mini balls, for example, and got very wealthy. And so when the war was over, there was this amount of wealth that people had accumulated that could be used to invest in any new idea or new invention that somebody would think of or somebody could come up with. So for example, let's just say you're sitting in your basement, you're really smart, and you're tinkering around, and you figure out the light bulb, and you invent that, you come up with it. No one's ever thought of it before, you figure it out. Well, that's great, you figured out how it works, and maybe you have constructed a light bulb in your basement. That is not a light bulb industry yet. What has to happen is a lot of money has to be invested into producing them, building a factory, hiring workers, and then maybe you might have a light bulb industry. You're just a lowly old single person all by yourself in your basement. You're not going to be able to make that happen. So what that person will do, who invented the light bulb, for example, might go to some wealthy factory owner that made a lot of money during the war years and say, hey, I want you to see this idea of mine. You show them the idea of your light bulb, and that person says, wow, that's going places. There's something to be said about that. I'm willing to invest my money in helping you build an industry. And now all of a sudden you create an industry. So that's sort of a simplified explanation of how how these new inventions and ideas turned into businesses. A lot more to come on explaining how that all unfolded as we go through the chapter. Okay, so you put all that together and boom, we are ready to have a growth and an expansion of industry in America. So today I want to just focus on two industries, two natural resources, I guess, to go back to that first slide, that have a lot to do with the way this unfolds. And we're going to talk a little bit about oil and steel. I'm going to reverse that order. Let's talk about steel first. See what I did there? You're steel the one. All right, now, steel is a product that will end up replacing, essentially, will end up replacing wood as the new building material of the future. And steel was something we understood what it was, we knew what it was, but it was not something that we could easily, cheaply, readily develop. Iron, we could make iron, and we had been making iron for a very, very long time. But iron and steel, they're different. Steel is certainly much better than iron. Steel is a stronger material. While it's stronger, it's actually lighter though and easier to work with. And even though it is stronger, it's also more flexible than iron. And because of that, it made for a much better building material than iron or certainly wood. But the process to make steel was not that easy. It was not simple. It was, I'm going to give you a very simplified version of it, but I think that it'll make sense and it'll give you the basic idea. So in order to make iron, for example, you take iron ore, which is a mineral out of the ground, you put it into a furnace. You take coal to heat it up. You take some other chemicals and some other minerals, you mix them into this mixture, this liquid mixture, and you heat it real hot, and all of it combines, and then you pour it out into a mold and you let it cool and harden into iron. And that's how you have iron. Now, in order to make steel, it's pretty much the same process, but steel is just a super pure iron. It's iron without any of the imperfections that iron has. And in order to create that, you have to burn that mixture so much hotter than you would do it to make iron, to burn all of the bad crap out of the mixture and turn it into steel. The problem was we did not have a way to efficiently, effectively, and affordably burn this iron mixture hot enough to turn it into steel, until a guy figures out how to do that. All that changes when Henry Bessemer comes up with a new, what will be called, you could refer to it as the Bessemer process, his idea, or you could call it the Bessemer converter, which was the actual oven that he designed. And it was a process and an oven wherein you would do all the same things to make iron. You put the iron ore in, you put coke in, which is a thing we'll talk about later with Carnegie, put some other chemicals, some other mixtures, you start mixing it together, you start heating it up. But at some point, you got to make that mixture hotter to burn off all of the imperfections inside that mixture to turn it into steel. How are we going to do that? Bessemer figured out an easy and cheap way to do that. Let me ask you this. What happens at the end of your fire whenever you decide, ooh, we still need to roast some marshmallows, but all the fire is pretty much burned down and all we have are some coals in the bottom there. What are you going to do to get those coals fired up again? You get down there and you blow across those coals, right? Oxygen feeds fire and makes it burn hot. So what the Bessemer converter did, it was this big oven, and you take your iron ore, you put it in there, you take your coke, you put it in there, you take some other elements in there and some other chemicals and some other ingredients, you start mixing it up, and at a key point in that process, there was a chamber that would open up and blow oxygen into the furnace where the coal was making it hot. And it would just do it for a split second, and the temperature of the furnace would just spike really high, just like when you blow across the coals. When that would happen, the temperature inside the furnace and for that mixture would get so hot, so fast, it would burn all of the bad stuff out of the mixture, and it would turn that iron mixture into steel. And they would pour it out, it would cool and harden, and it would be steel. And again, the beauty of that is that this new building material is much stronger, it's much lighter, and it's much more flexible than iron. And that means that a lot of change is going to happen. What starts happening is our cities and our geography starts to change. Cities are going to start to grow. They're going to grow this way as people move into them, they get bigger, but they're going to start growing this way as well. Because skyscrapers are going to be a new thing popping up in cities, something that had never existed before. Prior to the invention of the Bessemer converter and the ability to make steel, we couldn't build buildings higher than a certain number of floors. Because if you, for example, how many of you have ever been on the Bicentennial Tower down in downtown Erie? It's that big blue and green and red tower down right by Hammond Hospital. It looks over the bay. You go down on Tuesdays in the summer. It's free. You can go up top and check it out. Otherwise, you got to pay like $2 or something. It's worth it. It's a great view. If you've been on that tower, let me ask you this. When you get up to the top and you're standing outside on the deck, what's going on while you're standing out there on that tower? What's that tower doing? It's moving. As the nice breeze blows across that bay, you can feel that tower moving ever so slightly. The first time I was up there, I didn't like it. Kind of freaks you out a little bit, right? Well, the good news is that's what keeps it standing. It's because it's made out of steel. And steel is flexible, so when the wind blows on a skyscraper that is like the Empire State Building or something like that, or the Bicentennial Tower downtown, those steel beams and that steel structure will flex and bend ever so slightly with the wind. If that Bicentennial Tower was made out of iron, guess what would happen to it? As soon as a nice hard wind would come across that bayfront down there, it would just crack and fall over because it's not flexible. It's brittle. Well, with that big change, we now start building buildings that reach to the sky, skyscrapers. And the term never even existed before this. And in fact, just a little piece of trivia, the very first skyscraper that was ever built was built in Chicago. It was designed by an architect named William LeBaron Jenney, and it's the Home Insurance Building in Chicago. That building is still standing there today. It is a historic landmark, and people travel, architects, artists, tourists, to get a look at this building. I've never been to Chicago. I haven't seen it in person, but it's on my list. Just to stand in front of this building and look at this first skyscraper that was ever built in human history. And of course, from there, skyscrapers start getting built everywhere, right? The greatest example of the time to really illustrate the new power of this steel building material was the Brooklyn Bridge. I don't know if any of you have ever been to New York City to see it in person. I'm sure when I show you this image of it, you'll recognize this because it's an iconic image in American history. It's in here somewhere. Oh, wait for it. Ooh, the suspense. And so there you see a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge. It doesn't look a whole lot different today than it did when this picture was taken, probably at the turn of the century. The Brooklyn Bridge. The bridge itself is actually made out of stone and concrete. The steel that was used were these cables. So it was, at the time, the largest suspension bridge in the world. Nobody ever thought we could build a bridge across this river in New York City to connect Brooklyn and what two boroughs? Brooklyn and the Bronx, I think. And we couldn't, because you had to use a steel structure in order to do it. The Roebling brothers figured out a way to do it using these steel cables. Same thing, today if you're on the Brooklyn Bridge, walking across there, if it's a windy day, you will feel that bridge moving ever so slightly, bouncing up and down on these steel cables as well. Talk more about the Brooklyn Bridge later and its symbolism of the time. All right, so there you go, a little bit about steel. Much more to come on that as we go through the chapter. Let's talk about one final thing here, and that is oil. Black gold, Texas tea. The other major industry that grows out of the era and the time is the oil industry. Now, I told you there would be a little bit of local history here. Does anybody know where oil was first pulled out of the ground, where it was first realized and that we could develop a method that we can dig down into the ground and pull oil out? I have a feeling some of you know that the guy that figured this out was named Edwin Drake, and he figured it out in, building up, Titusville, Pennsylvania, all the buildup. Titusville, right down the road from us, was the birthplace of the modern oil industry. Now, if you have any idea about the significance that oil plays in our world today in terms of the economy, in terms of politics, in terms of global relationships, if you understand that, just for example, gas prices. It's all derived from oil being refined into gasoline, and you know that they're changing all the time. Sometimes they go up. You know, your parents are always complaining about it and worrying about this and how expensive gas is. Well, that's just one example of a product that's made from oil. Anything that you have that's plastic that you're using right now in your room as you're watching this video, holding stuff in your hand, stuff on your clothes, whatever, a lot of it comes from oil. And all of that started in little old Titusville, Pennsylvania. Now we knew and understood what oil was and some of the things it could be used for before Edwin Drake pulled it out of the ground in Titusville. We just didn't know enough. We didn't have the technology or the understanding to figure out a way to affordably, anyway, drill deep enough into the Earth's surface and extract the oil. Edwin Drake figured out a way to do that in Titusville, Pennsylvania. If you've ever visited Drake's Well, that landmark has been preserved to preserve this not just this area or this location, but this moment in American history. The early days of oil, the oil boom that will eventually spread around the United States and eventually the whole world, was really based on some people figuring out ways to refine the oil itself into fuel. First kerosene, today we refine it into gasoline, and there's some other things that you can refine it into. And when we figure out ways to do that, our ability to use oil and pull it out of the ground created a whole new fuel for this era. Just like steel became the new building material for structures, oil became the new fuel that our country would be driven by. And the name that we want to associate most with this business is a guy named J.D. Rockefeller. I just want you to put the notes down, and we'll talk more about him later. In fact, I kind of got ahead of myself and I skipped over something. Let me go back to this slide right here. If you didn't catch this as you were going through it the first time, I want you to put this guy's name down under the steel industry. So I'm identifying two people today, one with the steel industry, Andrew Carnegie, hopefully you've heard of him before, and then the other is that last name that we just put on that other slide, J.D. Rockefeller. We associate his name with the oil industry. There's just going to be a lot more on those two guys later in the chapter. So, crap. There we go. All right, so I'm going to leave it at that, and there are two short videos that I want you to watch that explore a little bit more about I didn't spend as much time talking about the oil industry. There is a history of oil, part 1, and there is a part 2. You'll have to check the updates to see when I want you to watch part 2. I don't know if I want you to do it right after this or not, but you just check the updates at Schoology and you'll know. So I'm going to leave it at that. More to come on Rockefeller and Carnegie, more to come on oil and steel, and a whole bunch of other stuff later in the chapter. Okay? I'll see you then.